In 3, 2, 1. If I went up to a North Korean and told them that Kim Jong-un has committed all these human rights atrocities, right, they would call me crazy, obviously, for the exact reason that Kim Jong-un has glorified himself, that has trickled down to the population of North Korea, believing that he is a glorified person, believing that he is more than just a person, right? He is a god, right? That's exactly what that is exactly what the principles of a dictatorship is, right? To control their population. And and second of all, we think that glorification does not actually make a leader live up to their, does not make their leader actually want to become a better person as a whole, right? So we think that the whole notion that because you glorify them, they have a certain expectation, and we see that this is extremely untrue in many cases, especially with the fact that in the cases that leaders commit some sort of act or they make a blunder, right? They don't admit it because they're glorified, right? They basically they cover this up with means such as censorship, with the means as imprisoning their oppositions, right? Until they become a dictatorship as a whole. So we think that just because it's a post-colonial country doesn't mean that a dictatorship is something that is completely necessary. It's something that something that's completely required in order for a country to become successful, and that is a point that I will be talking about later. Okay, so basically we think that we think that benevolent dictatorships they do serve some good, and we see that in the leader of opposition's case, we see that they actually talk about why benevolent dictatorships are good, and we don't think that that's exactly what the debate is about. But we think we don't completely disagree with them in saying that benevolent dictatorships are like completely bad, right? But we think that they're not somebody that we should actually actively glorify. Okay, so first of all, moving on to my first point, we think that benevolent dictatorships, especially the glorification of it, which is what the motion is about, actually blinds people to the pitfalls of their actions. So basically, our goal is not to become American freedom fighters, basically fighting for democracy, even though we believe that this is something that people should be exposed to, and being let know that this is a system of government that also exists, that also works. We think that actively glorifying them is not actually going to lead to any significant tangible change, right? And this is going to just reinforce the idea that they are a dictator, right? This is just going to enforce the idea that they have uncontrolled power in that country, which often segues to my first point, which is that it leads to the false perception that a benevolent dictatorship is the only path that countries have to success. So if especially in the case that we're talking about Singapore, right? We're talking about Lee Kuan Yew because he's one of the most famous benevolent dictators. We know that for many people in Asia, when you ask them, let's say in Singapore, right, that why Singapore is successful in the first place, of course they'll answer you it's because of the benevolent dictatorship and the benefits that it has brought. So this is exactly what is problematic in the first place. This is exactly what our point is that when you actually have a system where you glorify a leader so much, you have a population that actively believes that they are the reason why they're so successful in the first place, which can lead to many harmful impacts, such as the outcome that whatever the dictator believes in, the country has to believe in as well, which will often lead to many human rights abuses, which is something that I will analyze later. So we think that this is especially harmful when trying to bring in political change with the notion that, oh yes, because we have a benevolent dictator, we are successful, right? And one thing that many people forget, especially in countries where, benevolent dictators are glorified again and again, is the fact that it's not objectively true that because a country has a benevolent dictator, they are successful. We see that most countries in the world who have democracies or have some other system of government can be equally as successful as Singapore or even more successful, right? So we think that the notion that they became successful because of a benevolent dictatorship is often a product of propaganda, and is exactly why we think that it is exactly why this glorification efforts have been successful and exactly why they're problematic in the first place. So we think that something that's like mutually exclusive to all dictators is that you have to agree with all their policies and ideas, right? So even no matter how benevolent they are, that if you want to hold on to power, you have to keep your employees basically in check. You have to keep your country in check, and in order to do that, you need them to agree with you, because if they don't agree with you, obviously they will riot against you, obviously, because your whole point as a dictator is to stay in power no matter how benevolent you are in making change, right? We know that dictatorships, no matter how benevolent the dictator is, ultimately it does not become something that is something that is open to new ideas. It's often not something that's open to change, as seen clearly in Singapore, which is obviously like unknown to be like free country, right? They still have censorship, which is something that goes against a principle of human rights, which is obviously something that but dictatorships are obviously against, right? So we think that on their point is that on the point of speed and efficiency of a benevolent government, we think that that is something that we think that that's something that's true, right? It does happen, but obviously you do have to take the trade-off for transparency, right? So again, we're not trying to argue for the case of democracy, but we're trying to say that there's no guarantee that a benevolent dictatorship will stay benevolent forever, right? So we think that even though they do have efficiency, the fact that they're glorified, the fact that everyone believes that whatever they say is the word of the gospel, right? That if whatever they say is something that you have to follow, obviously there's no space for political ideas, for political change. There's no incentive for them to actually make any change in the world. And in the best case scenario, they will maintain the country as it is, right? But in like the worst case, you can see with active oppression, especially in North Korea, where the people actually believe that Kim Jong-un is completely right. They think that they are the number one in the world, especially with the propaganda that has been promoted, right? They think that Kim Jong-un is a benevolent dictator. And that's exactly the issue that lies in so many countries with dictatorships, right? That they believe that there's no pitfalls to the dictators. This was something that was already analyzed in my first speech, but we clearly see that there are many pitfalls to it. And the difference that actually lies upon other countries and benevolent dictatorships is that, in democracies, which is the most common example, it's more easy for you to call out a leader. It's more easy for you to actually call out their ideas and actually oppose them without being jailed by the dictator. And we think that the fact that you can't even name many benevolent dictators in the first place is exactly the problematic issue on why we shouldn't glorify them in the first place. So we've already given analysis to why we think that just because you actually you expect them to live up to something doesn't mean that they'll actually do it, because of methods that they have, such as censorship, suppressing their opposition that will call them out, obviously, for human rights violations. So obviously we've given analysis to why we think this is extremely problematic. But again, a proof of status quo and why we think that this is also extremely problematic is the fact that, first of all, these narratives already lie in status quo, that people actually believe that this is real, right? And the fact that you can't name many benevolent dictatorships obviously proves a point that even though a benevolent dictator lives, right, obviously their life has to end, right? Because with every dictatorship, they either end in biologically or they end with a term, right? So obviously we see that for every one benevolent dictator, you have 10 problematic ones, because we see that with a system such as dictatorships, the reason why it's not common in the modern world is because it leads to more problematic outcomes in comparison to having a more transparent system of government, which is why we think that we should not be glorifying them